Hello, my name is Cindela Walters, and this is my assignment for detective fiction. I'm going to give an analysis of an episode from the Inspector Lewis series. The name of the episode is Whom the Gods Would Destroy. First, I would like to talk to you about the creation of Inspector Lewis. He is based upon novels written by Colin Dexter, who is an English crime writer, and he wrote novels based upon his detective Inspector Morse. And these novels were written between 1975 and 1999, and they were adapted into a BBC television series from 1987 to 2000. Well, the popular series did have a spin-off, which is Inspector Lewis. Inspector Lewis was first seen in the Inspector Morse series, and he was his right-hand man. The detective and his Watson. Detective Lewis comes from a working class background. He's middle-aged and he does not have he's not unusually smart. He's a smart man, but he's not known for his supernatural intelligence. He is a very compassionate character, and he really feels for the victims and those who might be involved in the crime. He does share his personal tragedies, and they may influence his actions, but he's not afraid to share his personal story. Then there's Detective Sergeant Hathaway. Now, Sergeant Hathaway is a unique Watson type character in that he's very smart and he's Cambridge educated. So he is less emotional and he's a very private person, unlike Detective Lewis. For me, he resembles the Spock character, even though Spock from Star Trek was more intelligent than Captain Kirk. He never forgot his position, and Captain Kirk very much was the captain. And it's the same way with this relationship. Even though Sergeant Hathaway seems to know many different languages and a very bright man, he still keeps his role as a help to Inspector Lewis. So even though he knows a lot more than Lewis, it's still very evident that he is a subordinate to Lewis. Now, as I mentioned before, this episode is called Whom the Gods Would Destroy. And it's from PBS's Masterpiece Theater, which was first aired in February of 2007. The list of the characters are, of course, our Inspector Lieutenant Lewis, then Detective Sergeant James Hathaway. Dean Greenlee is the victim of the murder, and the case opens with his murder. Then there's Stephen Lynn, and he's on his way to be elected to chancellor. I'm not sure if they're elected or if they're appointed, but he has a chance to be in this very auspicious position. There's Henry Brundrick, and he seems to be timid and quiet, and he also has a very overbearing mother, and the two of them work in a bike shop probably owned by his mother. Then there's Theodore Platt. He is the sole heir of a large family fortune. He is very self-centered, boorish, he's a drug user, and he's also wheelchair bound because of a head-on collision he caused while he was drug-induced that took someone's life. Then there's Anne Platt. She is Theodore's wife, and she is beautiful and kind towards her husband, in spite of his cruel treatment towards her, and also she and Inspector Lewis seem to have become somewhat friends. Then there's Tina Daniels, and she is Platt's housekeeper. Now, the plot is classic whodunit. This is a very classic English type of detective story where we follow the detective's deduction and investigation skills, and we're watching that as they go through the steps. It also has a conspiracy component to it because it appears that the murders was based upon a group activity or a hidden group effort. There's definitely revenge in this story and vigilante justice. There are many mythological themes within this plot, and there's even a little bit of romance, a little bit of a triangle type of romance, but that's just hinted to. Now, before I go on with the story, I would like to point out the red herrings. This story has a lot of red herrings. The first one is the overbearing mother. She is so protective of her son that you can easily see her killing to protect her son. And she would even admit that she would kill to protect her son. Then there's an angry paraplegic man whose heart is just hardened, but perhaps this innocent young wife of his can soften his heart. So maybe he's not so bad. And then there's the kiss. There's a kiss between Anne and her husband Theodore that if you had assumed that she was just there for the money or that there's no love between them, the kiss happens, and that's a red herring because it takes you down a whole nother path and you want to believe that there's some redeeming value in Theodore. Then there's the death of Mr. Lynn. Now he is the main suspect, and then when he dies, that sort of takes Inspector Lewis for a loop. And then the biggest red herring is that the most innocent and harmless of these characters turns out to be the most conniving. Okay, to save time, we're just going to go to the plot climax. It's discovered that the three men, Brundrick, Platt, and Lynn, were part of a secret club they had that was very obsessed with finding new drugs and new ways to get high. They were part of a group called the Sons of the Second Birth. Anyway, these men took a prostitute and killed her to harvest her adrenal gland because they heard injecting human adrenaline causes the best high. And so they killed this prostitute 20 years ago. Inspector Lewis goes to the Platt house, and there he meets Anne Platt, and they hit it off, and they seem to get along well. He does not know until the very end of the story that Anne is actually the daughter of the prostitute that they murdered over 20 years ago, and that the housekeeper, Tina Daniels, was Patsy's best friend, and she raised Anne as a little 6-year-old girl from the time that her mother had been murdered. Anyway, Tina Daniels found a way inside the Platt's home. He, of course, does not know who she is, and she's able to bring her adopted daughter in. He falls in love with her as she cares for him. So, Once Platt confesses his love for his wife, they bump up the plan, and she calls him and says that this woman, Fury, who's been blackmailing them, who's really Tina Daniels, has kidnapped her, and he must tell her where he hid the body. If not, her life is in danger. So, of course, he tells her where the body is buried. Once Anne has that information, she confronts her husband. She identifies herself as the daughter of the prostitute that they murdered. He is so angry, upset. He calls her names. He cannot believe that he was outsmarted by the daughter of a prostitute. He threatens her, and then her trained dogs come in and maul him to death. In the end,
so let me see if I can
Anne
quickly conclude the story.
Go to the site where
sons
the
of
police
the
are digging up the
twice-born,
body
they're found
of their
out,
mother and best friend. So in the end,
the
the two
detectives find
women
out
go
that
scot-free,
kidnap
but with a lot of money because
Tina
they got
Daniels'
Platt's inheritance.
best friend Patsy,
and Platt is
Tina
dead.
and Patsy
Lynn
were
is
both
dead, having been
prostitutes.
killed by
They
Platt.
kidnap
Greenlee,
Patsy,
of course, is
they
dead,
kill her
having been killed
to
by Lynn.
harvest her
And
adrenal
Brundritt,
gland,
the only one
so
who
that
showed
they
any remorse,
can
is carted
obtain
off to
this
jail.
supernatural high that can only come from the human adrenal system. So they basically murdered Patsy so that they can use her adrenal gland to harvest this type of drug. So Tina Daniels turns out to be Anne Platt's adopted mom. And so Anne Platt, she marries Theodore, and that she convinces him, when she saves his life after he is choking on his food, she convinces him of her loyalty, and he convinces her that he loves her. And so Anne and Tina devise a plan for and they basically set up Mr. Platt to confess where he buried Anne's mother's body. So in the meantime, these two women convince Lynn to kill Greenlee on the ruse that Greenlee is very ill and he's ready to confess. So Lynn goes out and kills Greenlee. Platt is manipulated to kill Lynn in order to secure his wife's safety. And the only person that showed any remorse is Brundritt, and he, in the end, is the only one arrested. So at the very end of the story, Theodore Platt tells him the plot against him. He gets very upset, and her trained dogs, he lunges to attack her. Her trained dogs come out and maul him to death. So even though these two women have plotted and planned for these men to kill each other, in Detective Lewis's mind, they have not committed any crime, and he basically exonerates them.
What makes this very different is because the villains and the heroes, they are muddied a little bit. So we have the villains. The villains we have some who are repented and some who are unrepented. You have the villain who is so sorry for what he did, um, in killing this prostitute, and he repents and he's remorseful. Then you have the unrepentant, like Theodore, who is just, even at the very end, he is just cruel and horrible and no repentance at all. Then you have those who were manipulated. These three men were manipulated by these two women and they didn't even know it. They probably weren't as educated as they were, but they were manipulated into killing each other off. And then you have the manipulators. These are not just the women, the Tina Daniels and Anne, who are the manipulators. They, Theodore, the man in the wheelchair, even though he was bound to a wheelchair, he still was the most manipulative of the culprits in this. Then you have the affluent, these college boys who, probably had family money, and they were very smart, going to these elite schools, and then taking advantage of this poor prostitute and killing her. And then you have the non-affluent. You have the two women who didn't go to fancy colleges, perhaps, but they wanted revenge. Now, the heroes are, of course, the detectives. That is clearly seen that they are the heroes. But then the Avengers, in a way, were the heroes as well. Even though they manipulated these men, they lied, they caused them to kill each other, one in a very horrific manner, they could be looked upon many as heroes because the writer presented them as women who should be empathized with. And then maybe even the dogs were the hero because they had their own brand of justice. And speaking to the mythological character, the dogs could represent a type of judgment. What Anne had shared with him when at the very end, when she talked about revenge, she said maybe there's a small part of what she did he can share a little bit in that revenge, knowing that someone had to pay a price for taking a life, and since the killer of his wife has not paid that price. But then again, the writers also wants the audience to share in the revenge. There was a twist where we knew we did not like Thomas Platt from the beginning, but then when that red herring kiss happened, we thought to ourselves, well, if there's something redeeming, or that this young, beautiful, kind woman would fall in love with him, maybe we got him all wrong. However, at the end, we find that Platt is unredeemable, that he's just horrific. And then once we know what Anne's doing, then we want to join the side of Anne. We want her to become the judge, and we want her to become the executioner. And we have no pity, or very little pity, for Thomas Platt. He is torn to pieces by his dogs, just like the mythical Actaeon. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's a mythological character who is turned into a stag. He's a hunter, that's turned into a stag by the gods, and he is torn by pieces by his own hunting dogs. So the audience is sharing in the revenge as well.
So,
In
in
conclusion,
conclusion of the
I
story,
think that this was a very
the
enjoyable
sons of the second death,
story. It was only about an
3 of them
hour and
are
15
dead,
minutes long.
and
The
1 of them
interesting
is
thing that
carted
I
away
found in the
in a
writing
police car.
was
That's
that
Heinrich, and
the
he is the
inspector
only one that
and
showed
the
remorse.
murderess, I
But the
guess you
2
can call her,
ladies, they
they
are
liked
free,
each other, and they
and
had a friendship of
Anne
sorts.
Platt
They understood each other,
is about to
and
inherit
I would
a
let
lot of money,
I
making them both
won't tell you
rich.
the very, very end, but
Inspector Lewis is
both
perfectly
walked
fine
away
with this.
with the
However,
feeling that
Inspector
justice had
Hathaway
been
has
served.
some reservations.
And the fact that this story had
And
many red herrings
what
means that
Inspector
even as we are
Lewis
following the
is
detectives trying
probably,
to unravel
when
this
Inspector
puzzle,
Hathaway says that there's no difference
even the very most
between
intelligent, I would
Anne
say,
Platt and her husband,
were taken
because what she
aback by
did
some
was
of these red
premeditated.
herrings, which made it
And
a very
Inspector Lewis
enjoyable,
says that he sees it different.
a very
And I
enjoyable
think that we
story.
as an audience,
So I hope
we
you
too
enjoyed
see
this
it different.
media
And the main difference
presentation on this
is
story,
motive.
and
Platt's motive
I hope that you will
was
take the
to
time
pleasure
to rent it
himself.
and see it on your own. Thank you.
Anne Platt's motive was to avenge her mother. And so I think that the end of the story brings home a very important point, that motive, as it is in any good detective story, is always the key, is always the main point. If we understand what the motive is, then we can better understand what the truth is.